In my dealings with the planet as a whole over the last 20 years, I became aware that the single thing that was really missing, that was holding up more progress than anything else, was the lack of a clear vision of what a desirable future looks like. We just didn't have a sense of where we were going. The negativity was getting in the way more. And so I'm going to outline the negativity and then the reasons why we need to do this thing, and then tell you stories from the year 2032, where I have been. I used a technique of deep hypnosis with a team of people on Salt Spring. We had a building specially created for this with a set of guardians who would be around me during the 24 hours. And 24 hours of deep hypnosis gave me 4 days in the year 2032 in Vancouver, when Vancouver had become the greenest city in the world. We wanted to see what the future looked like when we did all the things we know that are possible. The first is simply the limits to growth. If everyone on the planet lived the way we do, we need 2 additional planets. We just cannot live the way we are. We're losing your resources. We've got to handle the resource thing. The second is that we're looking towards a world without oil. Everything we're doing is premised on cheap oil, and we're coming to a critical time around that. The third is the reality of global warming, and I'll go into this in a second more, that the mind-crunching reality of the ecological issues that global warming is bringing up. And the fourth is we're now looking into the heart of the black hole of economic collapse and financial collapse. What these lead to, the fifth one, is the collapse of hope. So all around the world we've got people saying, I just don't feel hope anymore. The number one issue coming out of Occupy Wall Street and the other occupies I've been to is the story doesn't add up anymore. Things don't make sense. And there's a lack of clear demands, and that's what we're saying, well, the whole story doesn't make sense. Something doesn't add up anymore. It used to be in the 1950s that, economic growth will bring prosperity to everyone. Just work. He who gets the most toys wins. You'll get a better house. You'll get a better car. You'll have a place in the suburbs. And everyone felt that hopefulness after the war. Now, people are saying, this doesn't work anymore. This story doesn't work. So what's the new story? So just briefly look at these things. There's the reality that we need 2 more Earths. And we're actually chewing our way through the planet. Every economic decision we make that's not specifically, environmental is a chewing away through the planet action. And so, how long do you go on doing this, eating away the foundation of your existence before something begins to fall apart? You can't just chop away your own ecosystem. It doesn't work long. So the extent we go to get fossil fuels out of the ground now is just tremendous. Al Gore suggested, it's like trying to find a hole in your toe that hasn't had the heroin injection to put the needle in for the final bit of energy. So now we're talking about doing oil extraction in the Arctic. Well, if we're willing to trash the Arctic to do that, guess how much oil we get at? Guess how long the planet can live on that much oil? 8 months. 8 more months of global oil supply. We're using 32 billion barrels a year, so maybe we get a third of 32, whatever that is, 10 or 12 billion barrels out of the Arctic. Sounds a lot. Unless you know what the maths is. Well, it's actually more like 20 billion. And it's 8 months supply. So for 8 months we can delay the question of how do we live without oil? Doesn't make sense to trash the world in that last desperate bit to get this stuff and to pull up the Arctic. There's Amazon on the left and what's left of Amazon on the right. Being done to raise soybeans for cattle for Europe's meat industry. Doesn't make sense. And at the end of the day, that's where it all ends up. In the landfill. That doesn't make sense either. Every one of these species facing extinction because of our activities. We get to carry on living. Humans ain't going extinct, but they're going extinct because we want to keep on this way of living. That's the extinction curve. It's 100 times greater than the normal background rate of extinctions before we got going on all this stuff. So, is this where we're heading to in our evolutionary journey? The brain has stopped working and the cellular mass is down in the belly instead of in the brain. Also, we're quietly and privately poisoning our kids with the off-gassing of all this stuff. The average newborn baby has got over 200 toxic contaminants in its body the morning it's born, coming in through the cord blood, over 90 of which are directly linked to cancer. And the cancer rates are not falling anywhere. So the question is the whole world being contaminated as the offshoot of this way of living? The challenge on oil production, the end of the oil, there's the graphs on oil, we've discovered less new oil every year since 1963 or 64, and yet we're using more oil. Every one of these countries has got declining oil. They're moving towards, these are oil exporting nations and now becoming oil importing nations. So instead of getting income, they're going to be paying income, which means poverty and riots written all over it. And the geologists, the petroleum geologists say, yeah, we're in trouble, peak oil is coming. But I want to skip over this stuff. End of cheap oil, Alberta's oil sands, blah, 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 future price of gas. That's the reality of what we have to do to get oil these days when you're drilling deep down under the water. So I'm going to leave that stuff aside now. So my question was, what does the future look like? And in doing this hypnosis process, I found myself in Vancouver. I arrived on a stormy Wednesday night. It was June. It was coming up to mid-June, but there was a massive, windstorm, rainstorm, hailstorm going on. But I was invited in to stay with a woman called May across the street. And the next morning, she showed me around her house and explained how, as a street, they'd organized collectively to retrofit their homes. There was about a 4-kilowatt system on the roof, and the price of solar was down at $1 a kilowatt installed. And so with the price of electricity being at 20 cents a kilowatt hour, there was an easy, commercial argument for having the full PV on the roofs. They'd done a whole bunch of retrofit things, mostly moving, towards a hydronic heat system with air source heat pumps. You didn't need ground source heat pumps in Vancouver. Air source is good enough. And a bunch of other initiatives around efficiency in the buildings. She took me to her fridge, and they had a collective system called Localife, which is a neighborhood-based version of Facebook. And they had 4 screens on that. One of them they could simply tap on the screen called Household and pull up the numbers, and immediately the graphs were there that showed exactly how the house was working. The other screens enabled them to make immediate contact with the neighbors on the block and with what was going on in the city of Vancouver and other things like that, very immediately available. And later on I discovered that through this Local Life program, there was an enhancement of Facebook. Really, you could, on your Facebook equivalent in those days called Local Life, you could mark all the friends who you were really happy to meet with regularly. And if you were downtown or somewhere, you could just see who the color-coded ones, and if they were willing to talk and be friendly, and they're in their local coffee shop doing nothing, and they press the button, I got Joe's in that coffee shop over there, and Jane's in that coffee shop there. You can meet up collectively by that easy means, which is really helpful for city life. It doesn't matter to you folks here on the island, because you meet anywhere all the time, right? And so there was a high level of connectivity. The neighborhood, I discovered also that there'd been a major shake-up in 2017. 2017 was the big shake-up year. And the movement of shake-up that had led to all this stuff, they called it Omega movement. And I wrote all this before the Occupy movement came up. So in the Omega movement, what they were doing was that the pressures for urgent change had accumulated. And they'd seen the failure of the Occupy movement, the failure to articulate what it wanted, the ability which, they ended up being shuffled away because they just didn't know what they wanted. So they said, let's approach this differently. Let's do a full scan of the people we're working with. And they came up with a program called Omega, which stands for OMEGA. O, open government, 5 solutions. M, meaningful work, 5 solutions. E, an equitable economy. Each of them has 5 solutions. G, for a green future. And A, affordable housing. That seemed to encapsulate all the things people were concerned with. And the 5 solutions for each gave them 25 solutions altogether. So 25solutions.org was the name of what they wanted. And these were really clear, tangible, specific demands, and I can go into any of them if you want to in detail. The equitable economy one was the most challenging, because this can't just be done locally in the city of Vancouver. They had to think wider outside the game on this one. And there was a lot of reading and research they had to do, which is not even apparent to most people today with the Occupy movement. In the future, they'd had plenty of time to get all this worked out. So in the years between, as it were, 2011 and 2017, they'd really done a lot of homework in understanding this stuff. And the 5 pieces, they'd summed it down to as number 1, they had to stop tax evasion and the tax system being rigged by the wealthy so that they were getting, someone like Warren Buffett pays 17% tax and his maid was paying 35% tax. That's the American example, but Canadian examples are similar. If you read the book by Linda McQuaig, What's Wrong with the Trouble with Billionaires, She goes into detail of how the wealthiest people use their lobbyists to rig the tax system to get advantage for the rich and not for the lower income. The second piece they understood was you've got to close down the global tax havens. When they understood how big the illegal offshore capital market was with flight capital, to the tune of between $12 and $20 trillion sitting in offshore bank accounts. All major American corporations keep their money in offshore bank accounts, and they don't bring the money back. Right now, back in 2011, they saw the corporations of the world are loaded with cash. They got loads of money, but it's in private offshore accounts. And so they found that the demand was close down the tax havens. And I'll come later into how that was achieved. The third one was reform the whole banking system so that the regulators no longer are controlled by the regulated. Tiny example of this, the reason why back in 2011 they had 28 massive increase in food prices was not driven by the demand for biodiesel and stuff like that. It was not driven by biofuels. It was driven by commodity speculation on the price of food. The reason that happened was that in 1999, the major financial banks in New York lobbied specifically to get the rules on investment in food commodities changed. Before that, only the food industry got involved in food commodity market hedging in order to protect the price of food and protect the farmer's income. That made sense. Then they got it changed so that the Morgan Stanleys and all the other big companies could play the same game. And now 97% of all the dollars traded for food commodity speculation never go near a pit of food whatsoever. That drove the speculations. They lobbied to get that change made in 1999, which deliberately led to the subsequent thing. So changing those rules so that the regulation is completely arm's length separate from the regulated. The fourth one was understanding, and I don't want to go too long on this one, that the current system of banking, which is known as fractional reserve banking, which means that all new money is created by any bank that gives you a loan. If a bank gives you a loan, they don't have to have the money in the bank to give to you. They just create a line on their account books. And some of the top economists are saying this is so shocking to most people they can't believe it's actually true. But all new credit is created by that simple line extension. And therefore there's risk attached to it. Because it's not as if even they got 10% of reserves to justify that. They got 1% of reserves now to justify the massive explosion of credit. And that credit's got to go somewhere. And so it's trying to find speculative things to go into it. So it goes into hedge funds, it goes into subprime mortgage speculation, it goes into all sorts of crazy stuff, which has caused the meltdown of the economy in the period 2011 to 2017. And the solution was full reserve banking. When you separate banking into two components, full reserve banking for all regular savings accounts, you do not get interest on it. But the money is 100% safe. There's no need for any more government insurance of banks. There's no more bailouts ever happen again. And you pay a fee to keep your money safe. If you want to put an investment account, you'll get a small interest, but the investments have now got to be real and in something real. And if you want a really risky one, you can pay, do a risky thing, but you'll lose 100% of the money if the investment goes down. So this led to a huge change in the banking system with much more potential for credit unions and other community-type banks to come in and run a stable, organized system. The fifth of the equity, the E in Omega, was actually calling for changing the definition of wealth. So fundamentally, the fundamental wealth is the wealth of nature and the value that nature gives us. And then there's human capital wealth that you have in a strong community. There's intellectual capital we have through the development of science and technology. And then there's money capital. And integrating all these things together, so when we measure our progress of wealth, we're looking at the health of nature, the health of our community, the health of science and technology, and the money in our banks. So the whole foundation for the future got changed and made much more substantial. One of the things that I knew was the case in Vancouver was that they had become zero fossil fuel. They were operating on no fossil fuels. So I wanted to know how they did that. How did they get electricity? How did they get transport? How did they get heating? Electricity in British Columbia was actually quite easy because even back in 2011, the province was 95% green electricity from the hydro dams, wind power, and run of river. And it was no problem in moving to 100% because British Columbia has got a massive surplus of wind energy in the oceans off Haida Gwaii, up in the northeast, huge potential for wind energy. And the geothermal energy and plus all the efficiencies that can be squeezed out of the system, about 30% wastage we're not using. But I had people asking questions about other parts of the world a little bit, and the data, the rest of the world was not zero carbon by 2030. British Columbia was. But the evidence was that the expansion of solar, with the solar revolution having kicked right in because of the price. And even a state like Seattle, a state like Washington State could get 24% of its entire electricity demand from solar, even with, when it's cloudy and grey. So it wasn't seeming to be a big problem globally in terms of just the time it takes to get there and the slowness of getting there. So transport was a big question. How did they travel around? Now, I did several trips in Vancouver. And the neat thing was right off the top, May showed me her website. I clicked on Vancouver and I could click on transport, and immediately I had an integrated website that showed me if I wanted to ride share, if I wanted to car share, if I wanted to transit when the next bus came in on which route, if I wanted to, to do whatever, where the bicycle share was, all that sort of stuff was available. So if I wanted to take a car out, there were cars on the streets. They were electric vehicles. But here's the thing. They'd introduced peer-to-peer car sharing. Now, I founded the Victoria Car Share in my real world back in 1995 or something like that, and now I've got about 400 members. But you have to buy a new car for a regular car share co-op. When they moved to peer-to-peer car sharing, so in a neighborhood the size of this room, instead of each of you having one or two cars, maybe half a dozen people had a car, but it was online designed that you can simply go online and book the car and take it out wherever you want for about $6 an hour. They copied this from a system already happening in San Francisco called Relay Rides back in the year 2011. And the people in Relay Rides putting their cars into the system for sharing were earning between $200 and $300 a month to put towards the cost of running that car. So that was beneficial. And the amount of tons of metal that you had to get around was reduced by tenfold. They found the average car is only used for 8% of the time. The rest of the time, you're just sitting there doing nothing. And so the community as a whole had this easy access to community vehicles, privately owned community vehicles, but integrated financially through Relay Rides and peer-to-peer ride sharing. There were also, community car share programs, as they have in Vancouver right now, with electric smart cars around the place. You can pick and go with them. Electric bicycles all over the place you can pick up and run with. Back in the present, they discovered that Washington, D.C., when it introduced its bike sharing program, had 18,000 members as of last week in real time. How quickly that had expanded. So you can pick up and go a bike wherever you wanted to. But by bringing electrical bikes in, they'd eliminated the hills. I mean, BC is full of hills, and if you're not a really fit cyclist, they're bloody hard work, especially if you've got a trailer behind you. With electric drive, zip, and you're up the hill as if it's flat. And the electric bikes' range back in 2011 was 60 kilometers. So, in the 2032, they were having bikes with an easy 100-kilometer range, electric drive, trailers behind them, and you could go where you needed to, wherever you needed. So out on the streets, I cycled from the home I was staying right downtown to Vancouver. I want to go to downtown East Side, see what it was like there. And on the streets, instead of a typical 6 lanes of traffic, 1 lane for parking and buses and 2 lanes each side in the middle, there was 2 lanes for cars only, and 2 lanes each side for bicycle lanes, but the bicycle lanes had 2 lanes in them. Fast bicyclists, slow bicyclists. And the inside lane was for transit and for, stuff like that. And the streets were just packed full of bicycles. Every kind of bicycle under the sun. There were tricycles, there were electric tricycles, there were different trailers, there were bicycles I'd never seen the likes of before. They were just so fancy in their design. There were folding tricycles, folding bicycles. And people were getting around really happily on these. Now, it wasn't particularly shocking because they themselves knew at the time that back 20 years earlier in Copenhagen, 36% of all people had used bicycles to get to work on, and it's mostly flat there. They hadn't bothered with electric bikes. But the cost of electric bikes, it was around $2,000 back in 2011, so it was $1,500 in the year 2032. But the payback on this was 9 months on a regular car. So compared to the price of running an electric car, why bother when you can have an electric bike to get almost everywhere you need? And so the transit service was also, really smooth and efficient, standard automatic practice. I went into a bus shelter once. It was early morning, so I was going off on a trip to visit a farm. And so I went to the bus shelter, having previously found out what time the buses left. And I got in the bus shelter. To buy the ticket, I just had to scan. I'd been given an automatic smart card by a friend in the house. Just scanned it across the thing, immediately took the fare. If I'd been a local, I'd have been able to have a completely year's payment system built into my taxes, so there'd be no cost whatsoever. So it'd be effectively free. When I scanned the price, it confirmed that when the bus was arriving. It also brought up a poem on the wall. It was a poem designed for Dawn. It was a Dawn poem, and I've actually got the words, I can't remember them right now. And then a second Dawn poem came up, and I was interested by this, so I pressed it, said press here, and a beautiful bit of artwork by a child came up, by this Nitya, Natashki. And it said, if you want to submit your art for display in the bus shelters, go to, childrensbusshelterart.org. And the children were displaying their artwork on the walls of the bus shelters. And I discovered that quite a lot. There was a really high integration of artwork and celebration with the practical stuff. And I can actually read you a little piece. If I might put my glasses. When I came back from hypnosis, I'd been programmed in hypnosis to have, really good recall. But then I had to write it all down because there's too much to actually memorize. So I found myself in downtown Vancouver on one occasion with a friend called Laura. And she took me to the Tree Frog Hotel. It was a street cafe shaded by a number of small trees, all very Parisian. She said, come here, look at this. It's one of my favorite bits of Vancouver. Outside the cafe, a small birch tree was growing with a trunk that had been split in two to form a figure of 8 before pushing out its branches. The circle on the ground had been paved with beautiful green and blue mosaic tiles in an Arab Andalusian pattern, with these words inscribed within it. We're all interconnected, the earth and the sun and the moon, by a friend called Rosie Emery, a friend of hers. She said, it's one of the many heart places that have been created around the city. The words make my heart melt. They make me feel at home. In the Buddhist tradition, the number 8 stands for completion and the fulfillment of all possibilities. I like it. She said, a city can be full of black holes. You don't even know they're there. You just fall into them. Places where no one cares, where there's no love. They're really bad for our mental health. They cause hyperactivity in the amygdala cingulate circuit of the brain where we process negative emotions. So we need to counteract them by removing the black holes wherever they can be identified and creating their opposite. Heart places like this that generate oxytocin, that help us build trust, empathy and generosity, which we need in a crowded city like Vancouver. In my right brain, I think of them as heart places. In my left brain, I think of them as immune system boosters in the vascular and nervous system of the city. Urban acupuncture, some people call it. Little spots all over the city where new life energy is injected into our hearts and out into the city. And there was this fusion of the artistic realm and the practical realm that was just present everywhere, and I just loved it. At one point, going across the Canby Bridge, there was a huge banner across the street, and it said across the banner, "Welcome to the land that ugliness forgot." And it was that sense of celebration. So actually, I was down in Gastown, and the whole of Gastown Street had been pedestrianised. But more than that, they'd repaved the whole street with another beautiful Celtic mosaic knot design in blue and green and gold. And at the centre of each Celtic knot, there was a place. And I saw tourists doing this, and if you jumped up and down 2 or 3 times, a whole series of LED lights came out and scattered all through the Celtic knot. It was their equivalent of the gas bell thing, which all the tourists see. But there was just a celebration of the arts as part of all this thing. So I knew that the downtown east side had been, in my time, a place of defeat, of exhaustion, of difficulty, of struggle, of poverty, of homelessness, of murder. So I wanted to see what had changed in the downtown east side. And so I found myself at the corner of Hastings and Main, and the first thing I noticed was basically at the centre of Hastings and Main, or not centre, but off to one side, there was a fountain. Not in the middle of the street, because there was still traffic going to and fro, but instead of the same 6 lanes, you got 2 lanes of traffic only, and they had to weave around the fountain, because the fountain had been pedestrianised right across to the Carnegie Centre. And the massively larger area of pedestrian activity, with tables, people playing shuffleboard and playing chess and playing drafts and all sorts of things, and just talking. And the old grungy rooming hotels were just blossoming with window boxes and flower and fresh paint. And I had to dig in a lot to find out what had really happened to change all this. And it's a longer story than I can tell now. The core of it started with the A in Omega, which stands for affordable housing. And the changes that Vancouver had put in place to tackle the affordable housing crisis, where it was just like, before they got a handle on that, the average price for a house was $1 million, and it was just really a struggle to find anywhere to live. And they put in place, if I can remember the 5 solutions they put in place without referring to my notes, first of all, they'd simply put a levy on every real estate sale above a certain price, going into a fund for community housing benefit. So they had money set aside for community housing construction. Every neighborhood then had set up a community housing circle with a structured non-profit corporation that could actually build new constructed buildings. The third one, if I recall rightly, was the permission for houses to be built as small as 350 square feet, for every house to have a secondary suite, and for cob and straw bale buildings to be normalized into the building code, so you could do that in a normal kind of manner if you wanted to go that way. The fourth one on housing, was actually the system to set up tenants' councils in all the rental properties. The equivalent of a strata council for a condo, but tenants' councils were formalized to work with landlords to make the properties in apartment buildings more participatory, so with a green team inside each of them, more sense of community and not just everyone feeling at war with the landlord. And the fifth one was a rural initiative that any rural farm that had more than 20 hectares was allowed to establish a small, tight eco-village cluster for housing on that farm. Specifically coming because with the change to organic farming, there was need for more labor on the land. People wanted to live on the land, but they weren't allowed to do so under the current rules. And there was a rule set up, because I went to visit a farm near Abbotsford with an eco-village attached to it, which on the Saturday afternoon I made that trip, and it was just intriguing. But within the eco-village, they got a rule that 50% of the income of anyone living there must come from farming or farm-related activities. Because they saw the danger of, urban commuters just, moving in and out and pretending to live the rural lifestyle, but actually just driving to and fro in their electric vehicles or their buses, whatever they wanted. And so the Farms Act, when I visited the farm, and I'm going all over the place, but bring me back if you need to. I took the train from right downtown Vancouver on the West Coast Express, which had been extended out to Abbotsford, and then went on the farm. On the train, during my ride on the train, I had a talk with a man called Brad Wallfish. Maybe I'll tell you Brad Wallfish's story now because it ties to the tax havens. And then remember, I'm going to the farm. Otherwise, I tell you, in 4 days, I had a lot that I experienced, and it's hard to encapsulate it. But Brad Wallfish, who I met on the train, had been a millionaire by the time he left school. So he set up an app that enabled his schoolmates to trade in hedge funds, and they'd all been millionaires. He made $1 million from them. He was a billionaire by the time he was 25. With money parked all over the place and all sorts of illegal things. He had a wife and 2 kids in Vancouver. He had a mistress in Shanghai. He had a sort of, fancy suite in Davos, Switzerland. And then he got drug-resistant gonorrhea. No known cure. This was, for a man with a Tiger Woods mentality, not a happy scene. And so his wife divorced him. He had a child by his mistress who was born with meningitis, who was blind and died at 1 year old. His wife then committed suicide, and he was really going through a terrible time. So he had a year to think what he'd done with his life. And he realized how he'd been enjoying the tax haven system and the offshore banking, and he said, this is fundamentally what's wrong here. So he made contact with the Tax Justice Network, which was an organization established in Britain back in the early 2000s. And he turned himself in, saying, I know the system inside out. I want to help you eliminate those global tax havens. And a number of things happened that were outside their miniature control, but they had a big global treaty called the Dakar Treaty, equivalent to Bretton Woods, that happened in Dakar in Bangladesh, to reform a lot of stuff on the global financial level. And specifically, one of the key pieces that had to be put in place was transparency regulations, that anyone earning money in every country had to be able to declare it to the country of their origin, so you couldn't have the tax hiding. But then the fun stuff came because Warren Buffett, the same guy who back in 2011 had put an advert in the paper saying, I'm paying 17% taxes and my maid is paying 35%, you've got to tax the rich more, there's something wrong with this. He put $5 billion into a fund called Buffett's Bounty. And Buffett's Bounty was there deliberately to persuade people working inside the tax havens to get the information, put it on a disc, on a stick, and give it to the tax authorities. And so she thought she worked in Wilmington, Delaware, working in an office where 250,000 US corporations had their head office. The whole thing was set up as a tax fraud, as it is right now. And so she took note of the Buffett's Bounty. She made a deal. She's a little old, she's called Minnie Milkenbaum. She's a little old lady. She's a raging granny on the quiet, but she's quietly working in here for all of her $20 an hour doing this stuff. And she got all the information on a stick, gave it to the US tax authorities, gave it to WikiLeaks and to another group, and took her $5 million, her payoff, bought an island off the Caribbean with a new husband and a lifetime supply of taquiris, right? So she was happy, and by this kind of system, we had to get the tax havens closed down because someone said, well, why can't we just go and invade them? I mean, they're just islands. But when they discovered, the Occupy movement was analyzing this back in the 2012, 2013 time, that you can't invade a tax haven. They've got flee clauses built into them. So if you're running a tax haven, you don't know who you're running it for. You're the trustee. And if a phone call comes in saying, there's an inquiry into this, that, or the other, a flee clause is automatically activated. The money goes to you. You're now in charge of it, and you don't know where it came from, and it's gone at the speed of light. So even the journalists don't know where the money's going. So you had to have the new regulations, plus the high temptation to spill the beans for the people working the system. So getting the tax havens closed down made a huge difference to the global economy. There was no more tax fraud. There was no more sort of, lazy evasion. So, as I said, I was traveling out to the farm. The farm was interesting because it was about 100 acres, owned by an Italian family called Joey's Farm. They were, traditional Italian family. But 50% of their income came from educational activities. They were growing vegetables and crops. They'd given up doing meat. They were fundamentally vegetables, all organic. And I was inquiring about that earlier. The whole of Canada had gone organic quite a few years earlier, simply for the reasons that the price of the artificial inputs, the nitrogens, the phosphates and the potashes, had begun to get so high. The yields from organic growers had been just as good. The yields were falling for the non-organic farmers because increasingly the fields were just, grit with chemicals holding them together to get the soil to plants to stand up in. So the yields were just as good. The costs were getting higher. The climate impacts were just constantly coming more and more with massive. The floods were more floody, the droughts were more droughty, the tornadoes were more tornado-y. And they discovered that in drought years, organic crops gave you greater yields. Because organic soil stored, more carbon and stored more moisture, so you got higher yields in the drought years. And in the prairies, they were getting a pattern of regular flooding in the spring and then drought throughout the rest of the year. So it got really difficult for them to work this stuff out. On top of that, Canada had finally adopted a nationwide carbon tax, and the carbon tax was including natural gas, which was used to make the ammonia for the nitrogen fertilizer. So the nitrogen fertilizer price was going really high. And so there'd been a nationwide shift to organic farming. But the key thing that this farm, Joey's Farm, was doing was the community engagement. And there's about many components, but the school, had a close relationship with the school. They had a dormitory set up at this farm. And eventually, in the high school, kids would come out regularly and spend a whole week at the farm, doing their classes at the farm, being in the fields, learning how it all worked, learning the vegetables, getting familiar with work on the farm. In return, the farm would do, when it's sending its food back, some of it went deliberately to the neighborhood where the school was based. They also had programs for disabled people coming out on a regular basis to sort of get, mentally challenged people, not physically disabled. So the mental challenge issues were stabilized by contact with the land, contact with the farms. They had a dating program for would-be organic, for farming romance, for sort of single people who wanted to fall in love with another organic farmer, and that went really well. They had a seniors program for senior volunteers who just wanted to get in there and do stuff, and a lot of other programs of that kind. So the learning was going on was a big part of all this, and it had massive feedback, back into the community. Wherever I looked in Vancouver, there was food growing in people's yards. There were regular street markets, for food, as we see everywhere now. But down near the railway station, which was like where the big shipping containers are for the ocean shipping stuff, there was a huge new agricultural farming hub designed for the city of Vancouver. The first time I saw this building, I was really taken aback. It's like a big dome type thing. But the design, anyone know broccoli romanesco? Broccoli romanesco is the particular broccoli where every single whorl of the broccoli is designed on a fractal principle. It's just stunning to look at it. How did they do that? And the whole building had been designed on fractal broccoli principles. So the inside of the heart of it was a huge food hall, like Covent Garden in London, where food coming in from farmers was distributed all around Vancouver. So it was a single hub for the organic, well, you don't even say organic, for the whole food movement. And around it there were special stores for food, for distributors, for added value people making sauces and jams and all this sort of stuff. But above it was residential. So the finance for it came from the residential and all these little micro pods all around it, and you could actually climb up inside and go to the very top and look down. And there was they even had a slide. You could go to the top and get on a slide and slide all the way down to the bottom. Because the architects had really done two things. They discovered that with the advanced AutoCAD design, it was coming back, way in the early 2000s, you didn't need to have right angles anymore. You could design stuff which the brain could never get a handle on, but the computer with AutoCAD design could go around curves of all sorts of stuff and still get the structural stability needed for a 10-story building. And on top of that, they were beginning to integrate the principle. All good buildings incorporate fun. They've got to be fun to live in, amusing to live in, as well as being zero net energy. It was taken for granted the buildings were zero net energy, in this instance from a district energy system. The district heat energy system in downtown Vancouver was fundamentally from what they in those days called nature source energy. And there were 6 different pools of energy that went into nature source energy, which is air source heat, ground source heat, sewage source heat, ice source heat, water source heat, and waste source heat from the organic composting program. So all of those sources, they're all using heat pump technologies. They call it nature source energy, with big underground piping systems to provide the heat needed. But with a new building like that one, so super energy efficient, the amount of heat needed was almost minimal. But with the retrofitting of buildings, a lot was needed. So at one point I visited a factory initially started on Gabriel Island by Georgy Georgiev, who's back there in 2010 making the world's fastest bicycles. He won a lot of Olympic medals for Paralympic cycling, and his company had expanded and then moved to Vancouver and become a cooperative making electric tricycles. And with the aging population, a lot of people who loved cycling and then began to get wobbly, they just loved their tricycles because now you've got stability and you feel more secure and it's electric and you take what you want with you. And so I got shown around how the whole cooperative worked. And that led me into another. I'd earlier had a session talking with a Chinese Canadian called Wei Ping in the Vancouver Green Economy Institute into the changes they've been doing to build a strong community economy in Vancouver. And one of the pieces of that was to do with addressing the income inequality. And one of the core pieces around income inequality was you've got to get the wage differentials down from 1 to 300,000 to like 1 to 20, 1 to 10, more manageable levels. In the 1970s, they found, the average corporate to worker wage differential was around 1 to 25. By 2000, it was 1 to 250. And, by the mid-2011s, it was, 1 to 1,000 for some people. It's just ridiculous, A person was earning, if you're a nurse, compared to a financial CEO, what the nurse earned in a year, the CEO has earned by mid-afternoon on January the 1st. And that fueled this anger that people had, that they were just being ripped off. So getting into cooperative ownership and also setting up regulations that every regular company was incentivized to move towards, first of all, employee ownership through employee shareholding. So employers were encouraged to put some of their wages into buying shares in the companies. And ideally, if they moved to a full co-op takeover, that was better. And this was justified because the Chamber of Commerce in Vancouver had sufficient integration with the new green economy people. They'd realized you get better economic performance in a cooperative when the people working there feel motivated and part of the company, when they're putting 10% of their wages into the capital stock. And they drew on the regions of Mondragon in northern Spain and Emilia-Romagna in Italy, south of Milan, which was established, back in the 1940s after the fascists, took over Italy. In fact, the most financially successful part of Italy run on cooperative socialist principles. When they realized that this was so, no one knew about this stuff because the media hadn't want to talk about this sort of stuff, but they did a lot of homework in those years to understand how does a solid green economy work. And they've seen the principles of self-help on a collective basis. You've got all the units are competing in the free market, but collectively they're working together, supporting each other in an incredible way, and it led to really good financial stability. So one of the questions that I was also searching for is how were they addressing this problem that every economic action was destroying the planet and was quite undermining the strength of systems? And I got to talk with Laura, who was an intern with the Green Economy Institute, and she took me to see their role model, which was, of course, this company doing the electric tricycles. It was called Varna, in fact. They had moved to a full 5-star system. So a 5-star system under the Green Business Certification Program meant that they'd achieved 180 or more points. So what is all this? So I discovered that in the full spectrum of sustainable decision-making in a company, you could earn up to 200 points for everything from green energy, non-toxic, recycling, staff education, the works. You had to get 100 points to get 1 star, and after that, for every 20 points, you got another star. So this particular company had gotten the full 5 stars, and soon after some companies started doing this, they discovered that the real driving factor was the consumer. Consumers really wanted to act on the gut instinct that something was going wrong in the world by supporting the shops that had the green stars in the windows. So if a business had no Green Star system, you knew by default they're trashing the earth. So the more Green Stars you got, the more you want to support that business. So the strong commercial incentive for the companies to adopt the Green Star business profile, plus the fact that built into that is energy efficiency, lower water bills, lower sewage bills, lower energy bills, better approach to commuting, better approach to everything under the sun. So it meant a good deal all the way around. And I think the numbers were, with the small businesses in Vancouver, they got about 35% of the small businesses signed on to the Green Star system and about 80% of the large businesses. Large businesses were easier because they can put an assigned staff person to make it happen. Smaller businesses was more of a struggle. So they had to have more of a voluntary input with teams of people going around to help them start green teams in each of the small businesses to do the necessary changes and get on board with the certification. But the certification had to be global. Because if you do it with some of the big box stores that still existed, they got 10,000 products. So how do you certify a setup like that? And it was slow product by product. So, the stores would take one particular line and then, work it through slowly. But there was a global treaty and agreement around the standards of green certification that got put in place after the big street revolution that happened in 2017 and the rest of the world changed. So with the street revolution of 2017, the fun thing was that they'd seen the failure of the Occupy movement. They saw that having no demands gets you no results. So they adopted this 25 solutions approach. Then they used the power of internet connections to do flash mobs here, there, and everywhere. But it wasn't just, let's find a peaceful bit of park and we'll sit in there where we're harmless. They would occupy and block a mainstream street corridor for 5 minutes only. They'd tell the media they're going to be there, and when they occupied it, they'd occupied it in style. They'd have fire eaters, they'd have jugglers, they'd have, the works, different each time, and it'd be fun. They understood how to work the media, and the media needs change and different images. Once the media's seen a tent city with tents in it, nothing more to photograph. They've seen it, so it's boring. Let's move on to something else. At one point, right down, they actually had a cable lined up with help from Greenpeace between two buildings across the street, and they had tightrope walkers walking right across the street. Cold in. All they had to say was 25solutions.org. Here's what we want. The message was immediate. So more and more people got involved in this, and they were doing these spontaneous street blockages all over the place. They actually took the example from Salt Spring back in 2012. When the low-income people on Salt Spring, who couldn't afford to live anywhere and were increasingly commuting in from Chemainus and places, realized that they held Salt Spring by the balls because they ran the island's economy. And all the tourist economy depended on them at $10 an hour. So they got together with their demands, and they weren't met. They had their clear demands, and they basically said, look, we're going on strike. And they did a 1 hour's pull-out of strike, and then a 3 hours pull-out of strike, and then they finally just blocked the ferry route. By the time they were blocking the ferry route, every entrepreneur on Salt Spring was onto the island trustees and onto whoever it was saying, change this system. Make sure we have affordable housing on Salt Spring. And they got what they wanted because they could so easily shut down the island. But they just never organized before. So the secret to the organizing was that a guy called Lucas, who was living in the cottage at the back of May's house, which was a converted garage, he had been a street person. Living on the streets, he left home at 14 because of an abusive father, but he'd been met by a union organizer called Jim, who was also a Buddhist. And Jim was breaking away from the regular union movement, which was there to protect the wages of those who already had jobs. And everyone believed you couldn't organize the disorganized, so why bother? He believed you could organize the people who are struggling marginally with low incomes and on the streets and stuff like that, as long as you use Buddhist principles, which are twofold. It's action and not anger, number one. So you've got to get inner anger control, and a lot of anger around on the streets. You've got to have internal process to get the anger out of the way, action and not anger, and avoid the extremes. Find the middle road. He treats anyone who comes up with a simple black and white solution. If they sound dogmatic and arrogant, just walk away from them. It's all about ego. The middle road is full of what's practical, it's full of compromise, it's full of achievable stuff, but you can get it done. And don't go to the extremes, because that's where ego is trying to make a difference instead of actual ordinary prosaic progress. And so his role was really important in getting people to understand they could organize at that level. My goodness, what haven't I covered yet? There's just so much, right? I haven't told you about freight. I had a problem with freight. I wanted to know, how are they going to deal with freight? And I got a chance to ask, Alice Ferguson, who was being a city councillor, working on the Green Plan. The reason I went to Vancouver in this hypnotic journey was that Vancouver had made the commitment in 2011 to become the greenest city in the world by 2020. So they had the pieces on board, but they'd failed to become the greenest city because they hadn't addressed poverty issues. They're not in the green plan. So when they came back to do it again in 2030, they did, this time integrated social equity and social justice and poverty into the green agenda and done the transformation of the downtown east side with a lot of stuff I haven't even talked about. And so they got the greenest city status. So Alice had been a councillor during this time, and I asked her directly, what are you doing about freight? I'd already been noticing on the streets these little electric platform trucks with silver sort of capsules on them that were shuttling around, and I didn't know what they were. And when you're in my situation, you're going 20 years in the future, there's a lot of stuff you don't understand. You don't immediately ask someone all the time, what's that mean, because my story was I'd actually been in Ireland and been studying as a monk, and I'd not been following what was happening in the world for a long time, and I came from a really remote community. So I had an excuse for being kind of ignorant, but not too ignorant, right? And so she said, yeah, for freight, the freight crisis became really critical when the real oil crisis hit. She explained that the oil crisis, instead of being a peak oil thing with the price going right through the roof, with prices no one could afford, turned out in reality to be really different. It turned out that North America could not afford a price of oil more than $100 a barrel. And so whenever the price of oil pushed up because of the shortage of supply, the economy pushed down. So the economy got stuck in 10 years of quasi-recession, which they call the age of austerity. Because the economy was too dependent on oil for any investor to have faith with the high oil price, it's going to take off. Harmony with community is both possible and wonderful. And that personal work is our means of finding fulfillment inwardly and of serving the planet. And these added up to a story that was meaningful. And for spirituality, there's enough amazing stuff in what science is telling us to not, and what Buddhism and other sort of spiritual traditions are telling us, to not need the ideological approach that religions give us. At one point, I went to an amazing Friday night service. It was called the Song of the Universe. It was in a converted church. And it was just mind-blowing. And it was designed to celebrate the integration of science and spirituality. And we all gathered together outside. It was an evening thing, Friday night, which meant the Jewish people could be involved and the Muslim people could be involved, because Friday is both a holy day for them. And so it was a very good fit with the multicultural approach. And it was a converted church where they'd taken the inner area and closed off a passage. You went in through a passage around the side. There was total darkness with tiny little red lights so you didn't trip over each other. And you got into the center. There was a massive big hall. The only thing was a beautiful image of the earth hanging from the ceiling, lit from within by LED lights, glowing exactly as you see it from space, as a sort of central thing there. And during that evening, there was shared dance, there was personal sharing, there was a slideshow talk by a biologist. And when she said, for instance, in her talk, she was talking about the miracle of cellular existence, that every single human in the room was made of 100,000 trillion atoms. And every one of those atoms was working in a cooperative, self-organized way to create that single point of focus. And she said, isn't that a miracle? And I thought back, that miracle versus Jesus walking on water, hey, I know which is the more miraculous. That pure miracle of cellular organization, but also by then, they had really integrated understanding about consciousness into science. And they were doing it, a new concept called syntropy had emerged, similar to gravity or entropy, as a major mainstream concept within science, which said that there is a global self-organizing principle that's been present ever since the Big Bang that makes all existence tend towards self-organization, and it does it through consciousness. The consciousness piece had been really iffy-wiffy, troublesome stuff for most of them. But what happened, in that period was there'd been a particular bit of research done which actually completely blew it all apart. They discovered that if you take identical twins, 1/3 of identical twins are reliably, consistently, and replicably telepathic. And they'd done an experiment and had them in 2 separate functional MRI chambers with their full brainwaves being monitored, 1,000 miles apart, and they gave one a real bang behind his head, and his whole body system, his brain system, blah, blah, blah. They could see which part of his brain had reacted. 1,000 miles away, identical twin, the exact same thing, the exact same time. So this meant that instead of arguing if telepathy exists or not, they can now start arguing, how does it work? Where does it work? How do we measure its workability? Stuff like that. And all the stuff people have been saying, like my dog seems to be telepathic and I'm telepathic with my daughter, and all that stuff was suddenly justified. So a lot of the stuff that had been seen as woofy and wooey, new agey, was now looking like, whoa, let's look at this stuff again. We know that consciousness is real. And the working paradigm within syntropy was working on the assumption that consciousness was created simultaneous with matter and space-time right back at the moment of the Big Bang, or as they used to say, the day when God became pregnant. That's how they called it, right? So the shake-up in science, this in turn meant that their understanding of evolution was not just biological. They then understood that this integration, this move towards greater consciousness and complexity went right back to the Big Bang, like when the particles got together and said, let's become an atom. And so that if they understood the whole of evolution was a drive towards greater wholeness, then they just had to overcome the crisis they were going through and continue this drive towards human fulfillment. Because they were experiencing already that everyone who felt fulfillment, felt joy, felt delight, loved life. And the more people felt disengaged, unemployed, left out, angry and bitter, they weren't enjoying life. Because that was a temporary default system. So when people as a whole started to get a culture that understood that when you bring out the fulfillment within people, it leads to more joy, the whole understanding of what creates a society changed. And the whole school system changed on that basis as well. So the number one goal in the school was that every kid should find contact with its soul while at school. Because in so doing, they discovered that when a kid makes contact, and they weren't shy of using the term soul, when a kid makes contact with its soul, it just comes alive. They do it through learning. That once you've got that inner desire to learn something, whether it's dance or mathematics, that is alive for the rest of your life. And they'd seen by their surveys and the previous schooling system that a lot of kids were leaving school and they'd never had the self-learning initiative switched on. They'd never learned what it is to learn for themselves, to be their own inner leader. And so there was a lot of other stuff. Some of the schooling stuff was taken from homeschooling movement, but the regular schooling system was there. But they had to bring in a lot of what was called personal learning coaches, because there was a lot of level of dysfunction with the kids in the schools. And they were noticing that, in a class of 30, which before the crisis they were still dealing with, if they had 4 or 5 kids with ADHD or cyber world disorder or parental loss syndrome, they were struggling. And you couldn't teach for the other kids with the disruptive kids. And the teachers' assistants, who came in 1 day a week on a Friday afternoon on pay, couldn't do it. So they actually negotiated with the unions to allow a whole bunch of volunteers to come in as personal learning coaches to work with the troubled kids, doing brain work. Specific brain work programs using the latest neuroscience to help them develop the inner learnings that they would learn how to tackle their ADHD, how to tackle their disorders, how to address it. They were doing emotional education in the schools around what is anger, what is love, what is fear, what is bullying, getting familiar with the language of all this stuff. And it just led to the calming down of the whole atmosphere in the school, so the troubled kids could get reintegrated in a better manner. But brain work was happening all over the place. For every 1 bit of brain work being done for a dysfunctional person, there was 5 parts being done in a positive way to enhance learning, to enhance creativity, to do quick language skills and stuff like that. So I tell you, this was an amazing future that I found. And it was a big struggle in taking it all back home and trying to capture all this thing. But one of the takeaways, apart from this is an amazing future, was they were saying, simultaneously with my discovering the good stuff, I come across people who are saying, what use is it? How does it help the world if Vancouver's become this wonderful green paradise? One of the kids I met, a 24-year-old called Leo, who had actually done a philosophy degree, said, I got to get out of here. It's just too green for I got to go somewhere dirty and green. I got to go to China. It just was, the younger generation was still pushing at the edges. But people were saying, if we haven't got the whole world on board yet, the fact that Vancouver has got 0 carbon, we're still pushing up. We were at 440 parts per million CO2. We were past the threshold of danger for Greenland melting down. And they're saying, if only we'd started this 20 years earlier. If only we'd not waited. If only we'd done it now. If only the alarm bell had rung earlier. Thank you.